Hi everybody, thanks for having me. So first of all, I want to thank AJ, Dr. Withers. I knew AJ before we were doctors, both of us, all of us, for not just creating the space for this talk, applying for the grant to bring me here, and working to get me here, working to get a ramp, working to all the things, but also creating the intellectual and activist space in which this conversation could happen. Intellectual space, I'm sorry nobody did it, so I'll do it. AJ authored 3 amazing books that you all should read. Fight to Win, Stability, Culture, and Politics, was coming out May? Is it Culture and Politics?
Disability, Politics, and Theory.
Politics and Theory. 2 things in disability. That's coming up, the 2nd edition in May, A Violent History of Benevolence, which is an amazing, amazing book. So that's a kind of the intellectual trajectory to this talk. But in terms of activism, I just want to thank AJ and a lot of you here in the room that came to meetings in the last 3 days. Of course, Ryan and Aero, and a lot of people in the audience that I got to meet, Amish and Bobby and Nicole and Laura and just a bunch of you. Thanks so much for teaching me about what's going on here in terms of housing and mental health and decriminalizing drugs and a bunch of other stuff that is both similar and different than what's going on in Chicago. And so for the next 30 minutes, 28 minutes, I'm going to kind of relay more general assessments, but also some of them are specific to the US. And then we will hear from Aero and Ryan and hopefully have a conversation around how that's connected to your lives here and what we can learn. In the next 25 minutes, I will talk about why prisons are not the new asylums. And so I'm going to talk about why disability and MAD analysis matter, and then why this idea that people ended up in prisons and jails because asylums and psychiatric facilities closed, why that's extremely problematic, and why that did not lead to the housing crisis that we have now. And so, first of all, a little bit about the kind of intersections that we're talking about today. I think it's very clear, and I hope to everybody in the room, that there's a lot of discussions, at least in the US, around mass incarceration. And since, in the last 5, 7, 8 years, also about prison abolition, defunding the police. But a lot of those conversations happen without any connection to disability or mental health. And that is incredibly problematic because, first of all, if any of you have ever been in a site of incarceration, particularly prisons and jails, but not only, there's a lot of us disabled people who are in there, but we are not necessarily understood as part of the conversation. And so, first of all, a little bit about the kind of intersections that we're talking about today. I think it's very clear, and I hope to everybody in the room, that there's a lot of discussions, at least in the US, around mass incarceration. And since, in the last 5, 7, 8 years, also about prison abolition, defunding the police. But a lot of those conversations happen without any connection to disability or mental health. And that is incredibly problematic because, first of all, if any of you have ever been in a site of incarceration, particularly prisons and jails, but not only, there's a lot of us disabled people who are in there, but we are not necessarily understood as part of the conversation. And so if the network of incarceration is connected, if halfway homes and nursing homes and supported housing and psychiatric confinement and jails are connected, then that means that the way out of it is also connected. And most of my work is about kind of a way out, connecting particularly abolition, discussions about abolition or closure of prisons and psychiatric facilities and other facilities, how they're connected to each other. And so it's really important to say that for people who are not, kind of privy to what we mean when us in disability worlds, when we say disability and when we say madness, what we mean is disability as a way of life. We don't mean disability or madness as a deficit. We don't mean of it only as kind of a medical issue. We mean it as a part of our identity and a part of a culture. So not all disabled people are a part of disability culture. Not all disabled people are politicized as disabled, just like not all gay people are politicized as queer or gay. Not all women are feminists, not all, and so on and so on. But a lot of us are. And the reason is because not all of us, obviously grow up with disability and madness, around us in our family. And even if we do, it's not necessarily talked about as an identity and a culture. We don't know that we have a history. We don't know that we have a history of oppression, which is ableism. We don't know, or disableism, as you call it here. We don't know that, I'm laughing because all of Age's book is about that. But we also don't know that we have a history of resistance to disableism. We don't know how we're connected to this history. And so this is really important because part of that history is the history of deinstitutionalization. So deinstitutionalization, the definition of it is that it's the transition of people with disabilities, particularly psychiatric disabilities or intellectual disabilities, from state institutions into, or hospitals, and into community living. The second part of the definition is that it's also the closure of these facilities. So deinstitutionalization, some people say, is how psychiatric institutions or residential institutions close down. But to me, it's not just a process of things that happened, but deinstitutionalization is a movement. And it's a logic, it's a way of thinking, and it's a way of pushing for change. And a lot of people fought for deinstitutionalization. They fought to close down these facilities. They fought for us to understand that people should not live in not their homes. People should not live segregated lives just because of their disabilities or psychiatric labels. But instead of learning from the lessons of deinstitutionalization, we often blame it for things like the rise in homelessness or the rise of incarceration. And people say, well, how come there's so many homeless or housing insecure people who are quote unquote crazy? Why are there so many people who are in jails and prisons who are crazy? So I'm here to answer those questions. So this is the only graph. I'm a social scientist, but I don't do graphs. This is somebody else's graph, and it's the only one here today. Okay, but in this graph, this is what happened in the US. So your mileage will vary in Canada, but in the US, there's a period of time in which the incarceration kind of epidemic or crisis soared, and it's a little bit after, you can see the kind of decline in psychiatric, particularly deinstitutionalization. So psychiatric hospitals closed, and incarceration soared. And so a lot of people take this graph and other things like it to say, hey, I know what caused the rise in incarceration. It was this, that psychiatric institutions closed. But in fact, we can complicate this narrative because, for one thing, it didn't actually happen at the same time. There's like a 15, sometimes 20-year difference between the when psychiatric facilities started to close and then closed down en masse, and when we see the rise in incarceration, and especially the rise in homelessness, that came even 10 years later. So in the US, we don't see kind of homelessness en masse until really the Reagan years, so the 80s. Deinstitutionalization in the US of psychiatric facilities was in the 60s, 70s, so about a 15-year difference. And why do we blame homelessness in 2024 on deinstitutionalization that started in the 60s? Well, that already should give us like double alarming reasons. Secondly, in terms of demographics, if we were to see these kind of, let's say, buses that were, a lot of people in the last 2 days talked to me about Riverview facility in Vancouver that closed down. If we were to see, kind of buses moving from Riverview into prisons, the way that it would look in the US is that a lot of it would be white women. We would see a huge rise in white women in jails and prisons because those were the majority population that was incarcerated. But that's not what we saw. We saw a rise in mostly black men, black and brown, who are incarcerated. In Canada, it will be indigenous people. So these are not exactly the same populations. Now, this is not to say that people are not doubly medicalized and incarcerated. That's not what I'm saying. But this kind of theory of we closed facilities, they ended up in jail is a little bit, demographically doesn't make sense. So the other thing then, and that's what is really important to me, is that this whole discourse around, well, people who are homeless are crazy, people who are homeless are mentally ill, people who are in jail and prisons are crazy, and so on. What that misses is that this category of the homeless mentally ill is not some neutral category. It's a category of people that we invented. Because mental illness is not something that resides in people. I want to emphasize this. Disability is not something in people. It's a label we put on people. It's a label we put on people based on difference and the meaning that we make of that difference. Now, that does not mean that we're all the same, and that does not mean that people don't have psychotic breaks, and that does not mean people are not in crisis, and that does not mean people don't need people to talk to, and that does not mean any of that. But we call something illness, that brings a whole slew of professionals, medical professionals especially, into the lives of people. When we call something disability, we bring a whole slew of professionals into the lives of people with disabilities. And at that point, we also bring things like, we're taking away your children, you can get married, we are taking away your rights to do ARBs, and so on and so on. This whole category of mental illness is a category that we socially put on people. So, over time, that category also changes. So what used to count, like in the US, for example, the psychiatric Bible is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and up until the 80s, for example, homosexuality, I'm saying that word because that's the word that was used, homosexuality was a mental illness. So you didn't need to be, gay and crazy or mad. It was just a category that was put, and then people fought for it to be taken out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And I'll talk about at the end about some of the problems with also taking it out. But the idea is that this whole category is a fluctuating category. It changes over time. What we socially identify as mad or disabled changes over time. And so the category of the homeless mentally ill also is a category that changes over time. And it's a socially defined category of people. It's not, let's count who's homeless mentally ill. Does that make sense? Because you can't count things that you yourself as a society defined. It's not like counting, shoes or something like that. It's again, a socially constructed category. So for people who are mad, or identify themselves as mad, again, people who are politicized as mad, which is not everybody, a mad identity is a form of a difference. It's a form of diversity, part of like biodiversity. Like a lot of other forms of diversity. It's a different aspect of being human. And the line between normal and not normal is not clear-cut. Another thing that's really important is that madness is normal for the people who embody it. So that, trying to like change people by, treatment, especially forced treatment, by psychiatrization, by medication, is again changing of people. And it's really important to also note that that changing of people comes from a history of colonialism. So this idea of there's only one way of being, and that one way of being is the white settler idea that's also connected to capitalism and productivity. And if you're outside of that thing, we are going to correct you. And I'm using that word specifically because the whole correction industry, which is criminal justice, but also medicalization, is about that. So we're going to correct you surgically, we're going to correct your speech, we're going to correct, we should speech pathologists, we're going to correct your actual language, we're going to correct your how you do your hair, we're going to, all of the things. That comes from, again, a colonial kind of impetus. So it's really important to understand that madness is normal for people who embody it. And that also madness sometimes is generative, and it doesn't mean that it has like miracle properties, that's not what I'm saying, but it generates things, including resistance movements that close down institutions. Blaming the housing crisis on this is incredibly problematic. One is because being homeless itself is very disabling. So to kind of say, oh, homeless people are all crazy and all disabled is, again, leads to a variety of consequences that I just pointed out to, like getting rid of people's rights, including rights to housing, but also institutionalizing them, taking away their kin, and so on. But also the fact is that when you do these kind of like surveys of counting the homeless mentally ill, the kind of things that people ask is, are people following you? Do you have trouble sleeping? Do you feel harm for your life? All of those are things that of course people are going to say yes to. But that whole counting makes no sense, right? That whole questionnaire is absolutely ludicrous from the lives of people who either are housing insecure or live on the streets, basically. So the budget for correction ballooned, and the budgets for welfare decreased. And by welfare, I also mean housing. And so it's not that deinstitutionalization led to the housing crisis, but they did happen at the same time because of the same cause, and that a lot of that money went into, in the US also militarization, but a lot of it corrections and policing. So why is then deinstitutionalization blamed? Well, it reduces a very complex process, like housing, the housing crisis, to a much kind of simpler thing, like, oh, you naive activists, closed institutions, bad, your fault, done, we don't have to fix housing or racism or settler colonialism or talk about anything, we are done here, thank you very much. And also what we're going to do is that we're going to bring back the asylum. So those are the consequences of having this discourse. This picture is from a film, so I only have like kind of 2 more points. This is from a film called The New Asylums. Literally, that's what the movie is called. It's a documentary. You can probably catch it. It's a PBS documentary. And this is a prison in Ohio. And what you see here is group therapy. So I'm not like making it up.
That's group therapy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How would you describe this image?
People shouldn't be in cages.
People in cages, right? Like, yeah, I don't know how else to, for people who can see, it's people in cages, all sitting in a circle, in a cage, in a bigger cage, in a bigger cage. So the whole thing is in a prison, in a supermax. So supermax is like the highest level of prison in the US. So it's a cage in a cage in a cage. And this is considered to be like good because most prisons don't even have group therapy. So if we think about, kind of the mentally ill in prison, and then think about how that is blamed on getting rid of other forms of incarceration, like psychiatric hospitals, think about how ludicrous that sounds when you look at what actually goes on in prison. And the reason why there's so many crazy people in prison is because of prison. So there's a lot of words on the slide, but basically that's it. So,
If I was trained as a counselor, I couldn't, in my good conscience, participate in a program like that,
yeah.
no matter how much money you give me.
Yeah. Which is why there's a lot of shortage of people, good people who go in to prison to do this, and you know, it's kind of how it should be, right? So it's an incredibly, and when politicians like say these things, it sounds good, but like it sounds like, oh, this is why we have so many you know, people who don't have houses. It's not about affordable housing. It's certainly not about, you know, settler colonialism or racism or anything like that. And it sounds like really good when they say that, oh, it's because you know, Riverview closed and we have all these crazy people, and what do you want from me, right? But then when you see what actually goes on, like you just said, in facilities, then you're like, wait a minute, this doesn't hold any water. And so I think it's really important for us to build communities with each other so we can point to these things to each other, to say, this not only doesn't make sense, it's incredibly dangerous for you to say that, right? You politicians and others, which is my last point. So my last point, my conclusion is, what we should watch for, which is the consequence of this narrative, and why we should be very critical of it when you hear it. When you hear somebody say, oh, so-and-so, it's the largest so-and-so jail where we live in Chicago, Cook County Jail is the largest mental health facility in the US, or you know, prisons are the new asylums, or people are homeless because Riverview closed. Whenever you hear that, the consequence of that is what I call carceral saneism. Saneism, just so people would know, is the oppression that's faced by people due to the imperative to be sane, the imperative to be logical or not mentally ill or not psychiatrically disabled. And carceral saneism means the belief that people with disabilities or people who are mad need some kind of extra protection in ways that often boomerang against us disabled and mad people. So things like, oh, people with disabilities and are mad, they need their own jail. That's very common now in the US. People also, we need jails for people who have drug use. Very common also in the US now. Psychiatric units within jails. Special psychiatric units for drug users, specialized professionals. So instead of the police, abolish the police, but let's call social workers. You know, all of these things, what they do is that they basically, again, boomerang against disabled people, but by other means. So instead of incarcerating people in one pathway, which is prison and jails, it's incarcerating people in other pathways, like psychiatric confinement, but also prisons and jails. So we're not getting rid of one over the other, we're just kind of adding more. And this is my last slide, and this is what's going on now in the US, which is we have, and I think it's coming here, because everything great in the US always comes here. And so what is happening is that there's calls to reopen asylums. Because the institutionalization failed, there's a huge housing crisis, for example, in New York and in California, which are extremely expensive cities, very much like Vancouver, where people were completely bought out and evicted out of their own neighborhoods. They've been at generationally, and of course, you know, Native people centurially, I don't know, since times immemorial, and are getting evicted out of those places. And so what the governor in California is doing now, just actually 2 days ago, Prop 1 passed, which is a huge bill that creates infrastructure to basically resurrect psychiatric forced confinement. And a similar thing is happening now in New York. So in these big cities that, again, having these like huge I'm saying housing crisis, of course, with scare quotes. It's a manufactured crisis. But instead of talking about it as such, it's talked about as the dangerous mentally ill. And what we need is not to address housing or capitalism or anything, but what we need to address is that we need to re-psychiatrize people. So this is literally right now, like this week, this month, this year in the US. I think it's coming your way, so I'm giving you a bit of a head start in terms of organizing, I hope. All right, thank you for listening, and I hope stay in touch.